other discussions that we have had, or the other issues that we focus on, book discussions with the authors and eminent personalities are part of our programs. And in fact, the other day, while penning a live sketch of Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, I came across, I reiterated this point that during his tenure as Vice Chancellor of the University of Calcutta, the Central Library came up and he insisted that the latest books and a library with quite modern, with the standards of that time, was put up during his tenure as Vice Chancellor. And books was something which were his constant companions throughout his political as well as his academic career. We have had, because of Professor Vivek Debroy and support from Dr. Uttam Sinha, at the foundation, we have ourselves have had quite a robust publication output. And that continues. And next month, we shall be out with the latest volume on India's national security as it has evolved under Prime Minister Modi's government. And both Professor Vivek Debroy and Dr. Uttam Sinha are editors of that volume. And therefore, I think today, when we have come together here, it's an extremely interesting discussion that I look forward to. Professor Debroy, despite his heavy responsibilities and his very tight schedule, has been able to give us spare some time to discuss Dr. Sinha's book. Dr. Sinha's book is the outcome of his research and fellowship at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And I think it's very clear for those who go through the book that it's based on first-hand primary sources. And a book of this kind, one waited for quite some time for a book of this kind. And it has already received attention, wide attention, cutting across the historical, historians community, strategic community, as well as the diplomatic community. And therefore, I'm extremely grateful to Professor Vivek Debroy. I'm extremely delighted that Dr. Uttam Sinha, with his long association with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation, wished that we have a discussion on his book under the aegis of the foundation. And I'm delighted to welcome both of them and welcome all of you who have gathered here today after quite a long gap from across the country. I see many seniors, I see many friends. I see Professor Matthew Prasad, who's joined us right down from down south. And I see who's been closely associated with education in Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, and many other senior experts, friends, and scholars who have joined us from various institutions across the country, from universities across the country, in order to participate today. So I wanted to just make a few prefatory observations, and I would like to request Professor Debroy to kindly deliver his remarks on the book. There is no time constraint, and you can, because we would all like to listen to him. And then I request Dr. Uttam Sinha after that to take over and speak on his book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirban. Thank you, Dr. Gangopadhyay. Thanks to the Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Foundation for having organized this and for having invited me. Sometimes when you're invited for such an occasion, that's when you're sent a copy of the book. And you may or may not read it, because making remarks has got nothing to do with having read the book. In this particular case, it has been different because I've had this book for some time. I got it in March actually, and I've read it. So my comments are actually based on reading this book. And I think all of you should read this book. Here is the book, which you probably already know. It's called Indus Basin Uninterrupted. Whenever I come across a book, before the contents, I am always interested in who has given their blurbs for the jacket. Sometimes having read the book in manuscript form, sometimes even without having read the book in manuscript form. So here are the people who have given blurbs. The people who have given blurbs are at the back, Nripendra Mishra, Chairman, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library; N.N. Vora, Governor Jammu and Kashmir; Sumit Ganguly from Indiana University; Suresh Kumar, Chief Principal Secretary to CM of Punjab; Ashutosh Mishra from the Institute for Australia-India Engagement in Brisbane; and Junaid Ahmed, Country Director for India World Bank. People who have endorsed it at the back. Who's the only person who has endorsed it from the front here? A dear friend of mine, a scholar in his own right, but please do note he's the only one who has endorsed the book here. And that happens to be Jairam Ramesh. This book is titled A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. Uttam Sinha is a very polite person. He's fantastic in his research, and this is a very, very well-researched, well-written book, as Anirban said. But those of you who know Uttam know that he's a very polite person. He pulls his punches. And do note what Anirban said. He wrote this book when he was with the Nehru Memorial. And do remember, Uttam also studied at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. So he has to be a little bit polite about Jawaharlal Nehru. That is the reason I made this point about Jairam Ramesh being up front and the others all being at the back. This book has 4 parts. Technically, it has 4 parts. It's, by the way, it actually says A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. From Alexander to Sikandar, so to speak. It has 4 parts, one of which is pre-British. The second part is colonial. The third part is what happened at the time of partition. And the fourth part, which is why most of us will read the book, is on the Indus Waters Treaty. On the pre-British part, depending on the timeline that you're looking at, I don't think one should blow the Indus out of all proportion. Nothing to do with the book. I'm just making a general point. Sindhu, the river Sindhu, was only one of the 7 major rivers in Bharatvarsha. And in all accounts, up to a certain point in time, the Saraswati was more important than the Indus. Unfortunately, for various reasons, historically, again, nothing to do with Uttam's book, Indus was blown out of all proportion. The word Sindhu means not just river, any body of water, and hence Hindus, hence India, Bharatvarsha became India. But if you look at, as I said, all references to our great rivers, Saraswati came before Indus. Or even if you look at famous references to the 7 rivers, you will find other rivers are mentioned sometimes before Sindhu. Gange cha Yamuneshchaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jale Asmin Sannidham Kuru. One of the minor issues, and he does mention it, that I have, and this has nothing to do with the meat of the book, is the Indus civilization. It really ought to be called the Indus Saraswati civilization, particularly given the large expanse of excavations, the large geographical area that covers the Indus Saraswati part. I don't like, all of us here, everyone who's listening in, is familiar with the basic contours of the Indus Water Treaty. What is the basic contour? India got, so to speak, the eastern rivers. Pakistan got, so to speak, the western rivers. And what are the eastern rivers? Every time I hear the names of the eastern rivers, I throw a fit. They are Vyas, Ravi, and Sutlej. Why do I throw a fit? They should not be Vyas, Ravi, and Sutlej. It's high time we began to call them Vipasa, Iravati, and Shatadru. Much more beautiful names. So far as the ones that are on the Pakistan side, the western side, Pakistan can call them what they want. But Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum, Sindhu, Chandravaga, and Vitasta are much more beautiful names. Again, nothing to do with Uttam's book, but I'm just making a general point. I think we should begin to call these names by their beautiful original names. On the colonial period, this was not the substance of Uttam's book, so he did not delve into it. But on the colonial part, there was a great debate in India which happened about railways vis-a-vis irrigation, to the extent that there was a trade-off between the two. And certainly in the southern parts, in many southern states, one associates the name of irrigation with Arthur Cotton, who actually was the first person in some sense to start railways in India before he went off to Tasmania for a reason that has nothing to do with what we are discussing today and turned his attention to irrigation. There's a lot of literature on what was happening, not literature, there's a lot of material on what was happening when irrigation was introduced in Punjab. The British were excellent at documenting everything. Initially, the British produced gazetteers for entire India, and then they began to produce district gazetteers for different districts, which were properly under the British rule. And some of those districts have an enormous amount of information, even if you are interested in water, not on the Indus Basin uninterrupted, but generally on water. Ambala District Gazetteer in 1883, a canal is being built. How much is that canal going to cost? In 1883 rupees, that canal was going to cost roughly, I'm rounding off, 25,000 rupees. How much did the government of the day pay? 10,000 rupees. Who paid the remaining 25,000? The community did. Today, when water is an issue, if you say that community and citizens should pay for water, particularly on something like a canal, all hell will break loose. If you read the Rohtak Gazetteer, District Gazetteer, parts of Rohtak were irrigated, parts were not irrigated. And the British say that men from the unirrigated tracts would not marry women from the irrigated tracts. Why? Because women from the irrigated tracts because there was irrigation, became lazy. This is what the district gazetteer says. Now, it's just in passing. I only wanted to make the point that there is a lot on the colonial part which someone else needs to write a book, because Uttam's book is focused on something else. But since I mentioned the word Jhilam, well, since Jhilam has already been mentioned, it's part of the book. I don't think too many people, Anirban will have read it, but I don't think too many people will have read a book that was written in Bengali in 1947 called Jhilam Nodir Tire. Anirban, I'm certain, has read it. I'm not sure if it has been translated into Bengali. It was by someone named Vinay Mukhopadhyay, who wrote under the pen name of Jajavar. And Shyama Prasad Mukherjee might seriously consider translating it and publishing it, because that book was published in 1947 and is a remarkable account of what happened in Kashmir in 1947. Of course, civilizations have grown up around rivers. Certainly, they have developed again along rivers. Certainly, after agriculture became settled agriculture and we moved from a stage of being nomads to settled agriculture, we built habitations. And India is very rich in rivers. The Indus Saraswati excavations demonstrate the origins of these habitations. And the 16 Janapadas, the urbanization, or one layer of urbanization in India was around that. But as I said, the bulk of this book is actually about partition and the consequent partition of waters, so to speak, and the Indus Waters Treaty. David Lilienthal, who was instrumental, if you read Uttam's book, you will realize, he was instrumental. Well, he had his skills because he was from the Tennessee Valley Authority. He was instrumental in sort of engineering the Indus Waters Treaty. But he had been sent on behalf of Collier's magazine. So had it not been for Collier's magazine, this is a counterfactual, maybe we would never had the Indus Waters Treaty. The question to ask is, whenever you have water sharing, there is a trade-off between upper riparian and lower riparian. The rights have to be balanced. And I think the question to ask, devoid of the politics, today, if we look back at the Indus Water Treaty, would we have drafted it in the way it has been drafted? Facilitated, of course, by the World Bank. Did it lead to an efficient usage of water? Did it lead to an efficient dispute settlement mechanism through arbitration and the Indus Water Commission? I think anyone with any sense of objectivity would say that no. At that time, maybe there were constraints, but today, if we look back at it, by no criterion was that an efficient usage of water. By no criterion was it an efficient agreement. And what Uttam's book does is it documents the process as to how we came by that. It says Indus Basin uninterrupted. I said Uttam is very diplomatic. He has not written the epilogue. And the epilogue is, it should be Indus Basin interrupted, by which I mean there is a strong case to get rid of the treaty. The Jammu and Kashmir Assembly has already passed a resolution to say it should be done. The Prime Minister has said that blood and water cannot flow together. I think as a country, we are just waiting for an opportunity. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. I'm just saying that as a country, I think we are waiting for an opportunity that Pakistan gives us to get out of that treaty. Because the honest to God answer is today, we would not have signed that treaty. The honest answer is this was a foreign policy disaster. Like many other foreign policy disasters of the time, when Uttam gave me this book, he inscribed it. And it says, the inscription, since he's written it on a book, it's, I guess, public. It says, history is intriguing, which it is. But what Uttam documents, being polite, he doesn't state it like that, but what Uttam documents is not that history is intriguing, but it is a history of intriguing. And there is a very big difference between the two. Wonderful book, do read it. And if you want, please write the sequel saying that the treaty should be done away with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Debroy Vivekda. As always, fascinating, riveting, and incisive. I think this is it's perhaps one of the best introductory observations to Dr. Sinha's book. And I also got a bit, provoked listening to you when you use this term. One was obviously, I think it was so musical coming from you in the manner in which you have been, you speak in Sanskrit, the way you have been chronicling that part of India's civilizational past. And the way when you said that we should start calling these rivers by those original names. And I think all of us will agree to that here. We should bring it into common usage. The other is when you said this was a foreign policy disaster. Now, there's another foreign policy disaster, in a sense, of the Nehru government, on which I have been writing extensively, and perhaps, if time permits, maybe because I don't have the prolificity of Dr. Sinha, nor the eloquence of Professor Debroy, but someday perhaps I'll write. Was the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, which happened in April 1950, which was a major foreign policy disaster, so to say, which really did not benefit us in any way. And with the passing of the CEA decades later, a lot of that was undone in a sense. But anyway, but being from the same geographical region that we are, the Nehru-Liaquat Pact obviously has an impact on our thinking and mind. And the sequel, Dr. Sinha, I think, must very seriously think of a sequel, History of Intrigues. I think that would be wonderful. You already have your next book in the pipeline, and the front cover endorsement must be from Professor Debroy in that book, the cover. Thank you so much. I think it's been a feast listening to you. And I'll request Dr. Uttam Sinha to please come in now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vivek Debroy, for the introduction. Yes, let me tell you that the second book is on with Penguin, and it covers 1960 to 2020. And the whole issue of whether to do away with the treaty or not is obviously going to be debated in that book. I'm grateful that you did introduce the book in the manner which you usually do, candid, pointed, and many of your observations are quite valid indeed. I'm grateful to Dr. Anirban Ganguly and the Shyama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation for having hosted this book discussion. And I thank you all for having joined. Let me begin by saying that while this book is historical, I am not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and international relation is my discipline. And I'm not surprised that many possibly full-blooded historians might consider me an interloper and probably say that history should be left to historians. Maybe, but not necessarily, I think. My submission is very clear. And as I was writing this book, I felt that it's important for people like us, researchers, to engage with history, irrespective of the discipline one is familiar with. It tends to give you a clearer perspective to some of the contemporary issues one is dealing with, and there can be nothing more contemporary than the Indus Basin itself, especially in the last 5-6 years. We have seen a lot of debate and discussion over whether the treaty should continue or not, and the options that India has, if at all it thinks about doing away with the treaty. I think that gave me a context, really. And when I joined the Nehru Memorial in 2019, there was enough, what is called high temperature over the Indus Basin. And I thought it's important to look at how the negotiation really happened. And it was a long, arduous negotiation, 8 years in the making. And there was, therefore, a lot of intrigues, political ongoings. There was a lot of strategic infringement coming from the US. There was also the role of the World Bank. But most importantly, there was also a great influence of political leaders. I think Nehru, of course, was centerpiece to the whole thing. But there was also a larger intellectual debate that was happening, which I have captured in the second part of the book. And I think for me, history therefore remains very contemporary in its nature. As the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce would say, history is nothing but contemporary. And I think that's quite relevant in the case of the Indus Basin because of its transboundary nature, because it requires considerable political management, as we have seen in the last 60 years. It requires complex hydrological judgments. There's many policy interventions that go into managing the Indus Basin. And therefore, it's important really to look back and see how helpful history is here in the case of the Indus Basin. I think when one attempts a work in history, one learns many things. And also one unlearns several things. And I have learned many things in the way I have processed this book. Now, apart from disciplining oneself when you're doing research and writing, which of course is quite required, it is foremost a matter of great responsibility in not misusing the facts or interpreting information to suit some prejudices. And one needs to cross-check references very carefully in historical work. Sources have to be noted meticulously. And all in all, it's a very lonely exercise. But I think at the end of the day, it's a very happy one. And therefore, the attempt of the book has been to make facts and information interesting, less pedantic, so that it reaches a wider audience and not just a niche water expert readers. I think the whole idea is to make the Indus Basin more in the public domain of what it is, how crucial it is. It's very much an existential issue. It's also very much a political issue between India and Pakistan. Yet the history shows that the basin was one. There was a oneness to the basin that was very important. And I think I've tried to communicate this thing to the book. I think writing is a powerful form of engagement. And the most effective part of writing is how effectively you communicate. And I think I've used anecdotes, characters, different types of phrases and incidents to weave a narrative that makes the whole subject very interesting. History is intriguing, as I said, as I've written. Rivers are also very intriguing. I think there is always a history in all rivers, as there is a river in every history. And what river really tells us is that they're not static, but dynamic. They're always constantly alive and breathing. And they have always a story to tell. And the Indus Basin has that hydrological heritage, but also has the history of territory and politics, as the subtitle points out. And I think it's in that sense, I've tried to capture, on the one hand, the hydrological profile of the Indus, and I used the word basin as a suffix to the Indus because, without the basin, Indus is nothing really. You have to respect the other rivers and the tributaries and the many streams and the water bodies that go to make the cohesiveness of the basin. And that is told through the history of the Indus Basin itself. And therefore, there is an emphasis on the basin. And I've counted in the book for the sources, the watersheds, the confluence, the mouth, the tributaries, which all go into the making of the basin. We do tend to get carried away by the splendor of the mighty rivers, and we tend to forget the marginal tributaries and the streams that go along in making the basin. The jacket, if you look at it, and if you hold the book or if you buy it, you'll find that depicts the Battle of Sutlej in the winter months of 1845-46, or the First Anglo-Sikh War. And the back jacket is, of course, the signing of the Indus Waters Treaty. On a shining and well-polished teak table, sitting in the middle is Ayub Khan, Nehru, of course, on one hand, and the Vice President of the World Bank, William Iliffe. There are two maps when you open the book. You will encounter two maps. One map is of 1844 and one map is of 1851, done by Herbert Edwards, who was the ADC First Anglo-Sikh War, suggesting how the British were detailing the topography and how the knowledge of the land and the rivers bolstered their authority. So it's that depiction, and in a sense, the front and the back carries that history with it. I think looking back is always very interesting these days in India, especially when you're looking at Nehru and the so many critical decisions that he undertook, like, for example, signing the treaty in 1960, like, for example, 1954 Panchsheel. And in the book, again, without not really being expressive to the extent as Professor Vivekar calls me diplomatic, I've used facts and accounts to position how Nehru looked at the treaty. And I leave it for the readers really to make a value of that and see how Nehru looked at the treaty, what was his worldview, and the way, in a certain sense, how he, his stature in itself and how he tried to control the whole proceedings was something quite fascinating. And you can understand the leader, the time in which he was, and also the events that were happening around him. Remember, he often missed the waterscape when he talked about a larger world vision of things. Mao, when he signed the Panchsheel, knew very well the value of the rivers in Tibet. Of course, Nehru did not. And even when he was looking at the Indus, he was thinking more in terms of cooperation, more in sense of world peace, India's great generosity, etc. Those were important points, but they were also not very fused into the waterscape of things. And therefore, we still have, after 60 years, issues about whether India was far too generous in giving away the water treaties to Pakistan, or what are the gains that we had after giving away the waters to Pakistan. India has been remarkably, in the last 60 years, a very responsible upper riparian states. And when you look at it vis-a-vis China, which I'll be attempting in my next book, you'll find China is a supreme hydrological power. But I think the worldview, the situation, the partitions that happened, the great emotions that came about, gave us a very different perspective on the Indus. And it is in retrospect that we look at the Nehru and the treaty and make our analysis on it. I think the important aspect of the partition process, which I discovered, was the role of the civil engineers, I think. And that was quite remarkable. Their understanding of the strategic importance of the Firozpur earthworks of the Sutlej, for me, I think was a critical moment in defining or interfering in the Radcliffe line, which eventually gave us a few kilometers of that crucial zone of controlling the headworks. Of course, the book keeps going back and back till it reaches the Indus civilization. That's because the nature of the Indus is precisely like that. Once you look at the partition, you'll have to go back to the colonial period, and thereon you keep going back. And then once you reach the Indus civilization, you unwind the tape and then allow the story to the flow, which I have probably attempted to do in the book. I think there are numerous characters that run along the timeline of the Indus, right till the Indus Waters Treaty. And they're greatly influenced by concerns of pride, power, envy, fear, desperations, and many a time sheer greed. And I count their actions and consequences on the Indus, which is recorded in the book. I in no way claim that I've written something completely unknown. And this is certainly not the last word on the history of the Indus. My contribution probably has been to unearth more facts and information. As I said, it is to present it in a more readable way. I must stress that the book does not interpret history. It only narrates it through historical characters. And that's why I think history is fascinating, because it helps one to discern what the story is. And I wanted to get the story out, not just merely what the problem is, the determining the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why of the narrative. And in the book, you'll find all these elements interwoven. And I also attempt to keep each period interlinked to the events of the Indus Basin. Not strictly in the sense of historical inquiry, but by identifying with historical figures, like characters shaping plots and their decisions. So you'll find numerous characters along the Indus Basin in the book, their decisions, their thought, their influence, and how it largely had an impact on the basin itself. Of course, I've not covered the Vedic period, which I would have loved to do, because I couldn't really find the characters sufficiently powerful to tell the story. But I do account for it, the Vitasta, and I talk about the Hindu ruler in Kashmir in particular, which I'll describe just now. I think the book has a lot of first-hand accounts, as Professor Degoy says. The diaries, the notes, these are all quite fascinating. And I think that was quite important for me to bring forth, so that it gives, references for future researchers to look at and delve into this very fascinating subject. There are 750 references to the book. Of course, Penguin was not very keen to publish the entire 750 references, but I was very keen that with the manuscript should go also the references. I think references are very important, I think. There was a certain style which I think is important to note, and this is a feature of current day writing, what is called narrative history. I think this is a style we are familiar with many authors, and I'm not counting the William Darrow Dimples and the Ramchand Gruas and the Sashi Tharoors. I mean, we should look at the young ones who are using this style of writing, and I think we do find many such. Sunny Chandra's The Tale of the Horse, or Vikram Sampat's Savarkar, or Gary Bass, The Blood Telegram. I think this narrative history is an engaging style, told almost in a first-person narration. I think it's important, it gets the readers hooked onto it. A history that is, in a certain sense, well-written and communicates with the general audience brings in great excitement, I think. The human elements become very important. So you'll find in the book a lot of love, greed, power, conquest, etc., all coming into play. And in a sense, I would say the book humanizes the Indus rather than merely treats it as a natural wonder. There are three striking points which I would like to observe as I have written this book. The first is that there is a continuity of history in terms of knowledge on water management. And I think that is very clear from the time of the Indus Valley, the Harappans, till the way we are negotiating the Indus Treaty. I think the Harappans harnessed flood, inundation, irrigation, which was called the Salaba, and the dry farming, the Kuskaba, in some of the arid plains. I think methods like storing rainwater and then channelizing it for irrigation was also very extensively applied. Evidences of check dams and reservoir, for example, in Dholavira, confirm to the fact that hydraulic interventions happened then as much as it is happening now. And I think this continuity, this history of knowledge of water management is very important when we deal with water resources in current time, which, as I said, is deeply an existential issue. My second point in the book, which comes out, is that water is tied to the idea of political legitimacy. I think we learn very much from the Indian history or the Indus history that water is part of good governance and moral responsibility. I think we've seen that through many of the gurus. rivers. And this is an important theme in the current government as well. Water is very central to many of the activities that is happening. Good governance and moral responsibility. Of course, it's also an important feature of the neighborhood first. When we talk about integrating the rivers for a larger aspiration, welfare, and lives and livelihoods in the region. Also for political stability, I think rivers become an important part. So there is this idea of political look at rivers. There's an account of the 9th century Hindu ruler, the Avantivar, 1855-83, of the Utpala dynasty in Kashmir, who was labeled as the engineer king, and he harnessed the bountiful water resources of the kingdom to bring peace and prosperity. So there was remarkable attention to flood management and irrigation, I think. And there was a critical importance of that to maintain social order. So I think rivers were becoming an important part of the king's vision or the rural's vision, I think. And Avantivarman is a good study in this. And his own policies and approaches on the rivers, Tasta, he brought down the price of one karwa, which is the standard weight in Kashmir, and equivalent to 80 kilograms of paddy, from 200 to 36 dinars. Such was the efficient water management in the difficult terrains of Kashmir. I think it was an extraordinary achievement that could not have come about without successful irrigation plans by his local genius, Suya, and I describe Suya in the book, and his local understanding and knowledge of the water resources. He didn't have great education, engineering education, but he understood the terrain and the land very well, so that he could bring in these various critical dimensions of intervention on the river and bring peace and order in Kashmir. Of course, there are, the medieval time of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and he's often been described as the wise fool for wide-ranging administrative reforms that he did. And many of them were of disastrous consequences. But he was quite successful in encouraging farmers to build their own wells and water harvesting system. And in fact, led to the whole process of 2 harvests of Kharif and Rabi crop instead of one cultivation. In fact, he was one of the early rulers to establish a department of agriculture, the Diwan-e-Kohi, as he described it, paying particular attention to surveys and expanding cultivable lands. I think that was quite important. And we see successive rurals, for example, and his network of canals that he initiated was later upgraded by and repaired by the British, I think. So that knowledge of irrigation, that knowledge of water management is a continuity. And I think that is linked to each successive period and reign and rulers. The third point, I think, is, of course, the colonial investment and strategic objective that the British had when they looked at beyond the Indus, when they looked at Afghanistan, and the larger strategic picture, which I capture. For the British, I think earlier on, the Indus was kind of an imperial migraine, full of intrigues and local unrest and the fears of foreign invasion. Yet they felt that its control was very critical to Britain's power and prestige. I think that, therefore, it had a strategic element around it. The great threat perception that the British had, the greater that perception was, the more desire to control the Indus, and therefore then have alliances with Afghanistan, with Lahore. They established great influence in Sindh and Balochistan. These were purely strategic objectives for which the British were quite prepared to take several hazards in the region. I think an interesting account emerges is the forgotten navigation on the Indus today, which was central piece and a key driver for the East India Company in the first quarter of the 19th century. And I often argue in the contemporary debate on the Indus Waters Treaty is that, heaven's sake, we should start the Tulbul navigation, because we tend to forget the beauty, the significance of navigation. And I think that is something we have lost on the Indus. That is something captured in the history of Indus, which I bring forth. The East India Company merchants, would set up their businesses with great enthusiasm, and they will, cover the stretches of the Indus, particularly from Multan to the sea, and they will note down all the navigational soft points throughout the year. that comes out, I think that for me was quite important. Of course, the book is full of dramatic incidents and encounters on the bank of the rivers, starting right from Alexander and Porus. Just to say that Porus, was the child of the monsoon. He knew his terrain very well. He knew every flow of the Hellespont, Taylor. But despite all that, despite all his knowledge, the great defensive value that he related to the rivers, he still was defeated. But he was defeated by the deception and daring of the Alexander. And I think, therefore, there are certain obvious military lessons there on the rivers that one can see through the history of the Indus. The encounter with the first Muslim rule invader who came to India, Kazim, with the Hindu king Dahar, is also very fascinating. Dahar says to his forces, you must keep your boats ready to harass them and subject them to losses when they attempt to cross the river. So rivers have always formed that point of time where you could resist an invader. It was a natural barrier, and lots of battle tactics emerged. Just like Genghis Khan and Jalaluddin Khwarizmiya from Samarkand and the Battle of the Indus, which I described in the book. It's a fascinating account of military tactics and sheer improvisation that these two rulers used, I think. These are all which kind of fascinates the events that have happened in the book. The book is also run through the travelers who came. And there's a great deal of account of Al-Baladri of Baghdad, Al-Masudi, who visited India in the 10th century. Also Al-Baruni, the Arab traveler who came during the time of Muhammad Ghazni, and Ibn Battuta, the Berber Muslim, who wrote extensively as he traveled the Indus. And those accounts, again, are quite fascinating. The three things which was of great revelation to me, really struck me. One was when the British looked to the west of the Indus. They regarded it as the panic zone. And you find that in part 2 of the book, Diplomacy and Commerce on the Indus. And Lord Minto's three wise men, as I described, John Malcolm, Mountstuart, Elphinstone, and Metcalfe, dealt with considerable complexities of diplomacy in lands that British were barely familiar with: Persia, Afghanistan, Punjab, especially with the objective of forging alliances. They had this diplomatic caravan which traveled the Indus terrain, accompanied with monsoons and sometimes the furious blast of the Western desert. But these exercises, these caravans, were also an attempt in geographic detailing, I think, intelligence gathering, and observation of the kind of social hierarchy that we get in and around that time. The other revelation for me, as I said, was the role of the civil engineers that I mentioned earlier. I think the alertness and the diligence of the Indian civil engineers, such as the erstwhile Bikaner State Chief Engineer Kumar, and I go through his diaries and notes and his own autobiography to understand the engineering perspective on the Indus Basin. It was not only the great Congress leaders who were nationalists or who thought about India, it was also the engineers who thought and had a nationalistic perspective. I think Kanwar Singh was one of them who realized very well that the strategic importance of the Firozpur headworks of the Satluj remaining in India's hand. And that led to an urgent intervention that possibly moved the Radcliffe line a few kilometers in our comfort zone. I think there's a great detailing of the last hour plea by Nehru and Louis Mountbatten on Firozpur, among other issues that was discussed. And that kind of held back the Radcliffe Award for a few days. And when the Radcliffe Award was announced on August 2nd, the entire area on the left bank of the Gang Canal was on Indian territory. And I've used original correspondence and memoirs of key persons. Also, the chief engineer of Punjab, Sarup Singh, played a tremendous role in the whole understanding of the headworks and the significance of the strategic control of rivers, I think. So these are all well encountered. I think it gives us a very different, well, it's a known perspective, but we haven't really emphasized too much on the role of the engineers, the civil engineers, that has a large part of the account in the book. I think that's which I found very interesting. And the last bit, I think, and the fascinating aspect, which I say Nehru convincingly unconvincing, I think is a fascinating aspect. The entire debate in the parliament, Nehru's own worldview is unfolds as the treaty progresses. It's fascinating to see the time, the period, and how the things were debated in parliament. Nehru was always supremely confident of his worldview, despite the fact in 1954, when he signed the Pansi, when he came to Calcutta and said the Chinese will never fight a war with us, which they did. Similarly, he thought about the treaty as being probably the ultimate peace deal with Pakistan. There would be no trouble thereon. In the last 60 years, we've seen the kind of trouble that has emerged. Would call him arrogant or anything else, but he was the master of his own making, and many a times it was fatal, and that's well accounted. Again, through his speeches, through the debate in the parliament, he always tried to present himself as a carrier of a broad perspective, and he always think we have to look at the context rather than the nitty-gritty of the negotiation. But the Indus Treaty required to look at the nitty-gritty of the negotiation. It didn't require to look at the broad, peaceful worldview, goody-goody concept. So I think that's the part which I really, when I searched through the notes, diaries, speeches, I really found something interesting to tell. We always knew Nehru's interest in international problems. His ideals, always clashed with the realities of power politics and interest-oriented relations, which he understood, but as I went through some of his notes, he adamantly refused to accept. And the goodwill and the friendship with Pakistan that was hoped to usher from the great generosity and sacrifice on behalf of India came to a big blow, as Ayub Khan, soon after signing the treaty, talked about the physical position of the upper reaches of the Indus Basin rivers and refused to talk about the Kashmir problem. So, these were times that one needs to look at, understand the situation, look at history with a clean heart and an open mind. Because this is a history that we still grapple with. The Indus water has not gone away. It's 60 years of the Indus water treaty. But we'll have to debate and look at the basin itself. What in the future? There is therefore
बस इनका है और ये सब सही है। इसका लगता है नेट कनेक्शन लॉस्ट हो गया।
Just joining in a few seconds. Got disconnected.
बंद कर दीजिए फिर। कर दीजिए स्क्रीन।
निकल जाए
ऐसे ही खत्म होने वाला था, बंद कर दीजिए।
लीक हो जाते लीक हो जाते
Yes, Dr. Sinha.
Oh, so sorry,
बोले
I got interrupted.
Yeah, that's what. But you were quite convincingly convincing while speaking.
Well, I don't know if you heard the last bit. I was saying that the Indus Basin Treaty has outlived its purpose. I think we need to give it a fresh perspective, not only in terms of sharing water, which is an important part of India's neighborhood principle, but also in terms of basin management. What are the challenges of the future in terms of climate change, in terms of the basin management itself? I think that is where the focus needs to be. The treaty was very limited in its conception and in its execution. The 60 years, I think we have maximized. In fact, India has not maximized the treaty. Pakistan has maximized the treaty. So what we should do at this stage on the treaty is to optimize the provision of the treaty that is given to us. And I think this government in particular is emphasizing on the optimization of the treaty. Once we optimize the treaty, we need to relook at the treaty.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you.
I think, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, India's former permanent representative to the United Nations, yes, he's there. The International Yoga Day diplomat, mobilized 177 co-sponsors for the Yoga Day resolution. He's there. He's got a very interesting observation. I request Ashokda to please come in because he's one of those very rare intellectual academic diplomats. All diplomats are intellectual, but he's an academic diplomat. Please, Ashokda, nice to see you. Please come in. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly. Thank you for inviting me. And Uttam, I must congratulate you. This is a major work. I have gone through it with a lot of interest, especially because of the question I put to you on the chat, which concerns my state of domicile, where my family domiciled themselves. My father worked on the canals of Rajasthan and of Punjab and Himachal. So for me, this book is a very important book in terms of my own personal family history. But two things I would like to ask you. One is regarding if you came across anything regarding the strategic or political perspectives of the princes of Punjab, the princely states of Punjab, who are not part of British India when India got partitioned. So how did they use this water management, which you've talked about so well, in terms of their own interests in getting more, in making sure that, as you said, Sarup Singh was an engineer of Punjab. How did the princes deal with this? This is an aspect which interests me. And the second is your final point regarding the treaty. And I think that no treaty is actually set in stone. As Dr. Ganguly knows, I have spent the better part of the last 7 years in trying to reopen and review the Treaty of the United Nations Charter. And I have met so much opposition to that attempt that I can understand what lies ahead for anyone who wants to start the process of reviewing a treaty. In the case of the Indus Valley Treaty, of course, it is a bilateral treaty with the World Bank playing a role. So probably it will not be as contentious as the Charter of the United Nations. But how do you see from the perspective that you put it of climate change, of the optimization of water resources, in terms of these global issues, which affect all people living in this part of the world? How do you see the popular support coming up, or can we work towards creating a popular support for attempts to either do away with the treaty or replace the treaty with a more regional framework? I mentioned it because just to the north, you are aware that there is water management initiative taken by Tajikistan regarding the waters from the Pamirs. And in that, China and Pakistan have stepped up to become partners of a project called CASA 2000 with Tajikistan. India is missing from that. But is it possible for us to look at a regional framework in which we are looking at a north-south alignment? Because in Asia, a problem of any integration proposal is everything is east-west. Nobody looks at north-south. And I and you have discussed north-south as an equally important alignment for our strategic reasons, for India's strategic reasons, especially now that we have declared ourselves to be a maritime power and the Indian Ocean is our strategic depth. So this is the context in which I put these two questions to you. Thank you.
Shall I respond? Yeah. Oh. Well, thank you, Ambassador Mukherjee. You've always been, quite interested and fascinated by the accounts of things in Rajasthan in particular. In fact, I remember.
Sinha, can you be a little louder, please?
Sorry, I remember you
Yes.
mentioning about Sadhu Singh's father, Maharaja Rangarao, and the 1919 Treaty of Versailles was an important part, and he was a great engineer himself, and he fought for a long time the canal system in Bikaner. They play a very important part, Sadhu Singh in particular, in the post-partition period. I think the whole idea of getting the princely states together, and Sadhu Singh was the nodal point. Of course, Nehru used to describe him in some of his letters as an eccentric person, but I think Nehru also used him in terms of getting these Maharajas together, lest they escape to Pakistan in that sense. And water played a binding part in that, I think. Much of the princely states of Punjab, I think, expressed themselves through, I think, the chief ministers and many of the localized leaders, I think. While there was a national sort of perspective on the Indus waters between two sovereign states, there was also a subnational perspective that was emerging. I think Punjab was very central to that subnationalism. I think they had a greater degree of passion, and often they would not agree with Nehru in many of the letters that were exchanged between the chief minister of Punjab and with Nehru. Many a times the engineers would not agree to what Nehru's vision was. Of course, Nehru was a leader, he was a statesman, but for them, Punjab was a very localized affair when it came to the water. And remember, there was also the hurt of the partition, which the brunt of it was felt by Punjab. So in that sense, water became an instrument of expressing that anger, expressing that frustration from time to time. And therefore, I think they were far more charged in retaining the strategic control of the headworks than many others were. In fact, the national leaders never had a thought on that because probably they never knew, these intricate headworks and the significance of control, etc. It was engineers that expressed it very, very convincingly and very forcefully to the national leaders. And I think that element we have often missed from our larger national perspective, or the partition period and the role of the national leaders. We never knew there were these actors which fed and pushed a certain perspective that emerged. And Punjab, I didn't really find many of the princely states and their principality expressing something on the rivers itself. But I think largely it was expressed through the political leaders and the engineers in Punjab. On the Indus, yes, I think 60 years is a long time. There is no exit clause of the treaty as it is defined and as we have signed on it. But the treaty itself talks about future cooperations. Of course, that future cooperation requires a political alignment. It requires a political climate to agree to a sort of a cooperative mechanism. So yes, I would think anything that one has to do on the Indus Treaty in the future, for me, first would be to optimize what the provisions are there for us. What is the point of getting away from the treaty when we have not exercised those provisions? And I think it's been a travesty in the last 70 years, a good part of that the governments never looked at the provisions of the treaty. It is only in the last 5-6 years that there's been some step forward into looking at the details of those provisions, making the projects that are given to us legally bilaterally and signed, and yet we haven't done that. So any call for provision, abrogation, or doing away, I think first we'll have to optimize the treaty to the best of our ability at this stage. And your ideas about the North-South, I think we need to definitely discuss in the time period that we have when we look at options for Indus beyond the Indus Waters Treaty. I think these framework would be significantly important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. We'll just take there's a last one observation here. Please tell us about the types of sources you used, especially for the Indus period. Well, a lot of it is there in the book, but I think you can at least.
No, I think, as I said, the book is based on facts. I narrate the whole book, you call it a story or whatever you may. The whole book is actually based on facts, and it's a factual account. Therefore, the sources are critically important. Letters, especially from Nehru to the foreign minister in Pakistan. Nehru always would like to write, he would like to express. Sometimes he would go and express something more than what he actually thought. So, all these things you will find in great details, the letters that were exchanged, the letters between the Chief Minister of Punjab and Nehru itself. Those are very critical letters, which clearly reflected Nehru's worldview, however unrealistic it might have been, and Punjab's more grounded analysis of what the water issues meant to them. The whole lot of, and the debate in the parliament, again, very interesting, because the whole debate is there. And I've captured the mood of the parliament, I think, which was completely against what India was attempted to do in the Indus water. It was a very passionate debate, I think, and Nehru was presented with some very uncomfortable facts by the leaders in the parliament. And Atal Bihari Vajpayee had made his entry at that point of time, and he has raised significant questions, pointed questions to Nehru, a very technical question also to Nehru, and I'll leave that for you to read in the book, because I really don't want to disclose it. But there was a whole lot of debate. For example, Ashok Mehta of the Praja Socialist Party, who was always, up for challenge with Nehru on issues of decentralization and nationalism, and he would vocally say about the disadvantage of what the Indus Treaty was all about, and that India was selling it away to Pakistan, he would say. And these are all accounted for in the book, which you will find once you read it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. I think, you mentioned this towards the end. I wanted to make this point that I think it's very important for any seminal work of this kind, which looks at a contemporary Indian history, at post-independent India's political history, and especially the manner in which you have narrated it. This the parliamentary debate component of any of such work is extremely important. And I have seen this, the way you have mentioned, I think this has really added on to the work, especially the Lok Sabha debate that you have brought in, and some very interesting, these forgotten figures. Of course, you have interestingly mentioned Atalji's intervention, and I like the point here when you have written, Vajpayee expressed his deep concern over the possibility of the UN Security Council intervening in the issue, page 274. He was also puzzled over Ayub Khan's statement that had it not been for the intervention of Nehru, the treaty would not have been signed. Kaun si baat thi? Vajpayee raising his eyebrow. We can almost see Atalji doing it, because that is how he was. Kaun si baat thi? Vajpayee raising his eyebrow wanted to know. Nehru had already left, and we will never know what Ayub Khan's statement meant, or whether it was anything other than being deliberately conspiratorial. Very interesting way you've handled the debates. This makes it even more interesting for those of us who look into these aspects. of the parliamentary dimension of historical decisions. And then you have reminded us of very interesting characters: Ashok Mehta, Arun Chandra Guha, S.C. Guha from West Bengal, erstwhile revolutionary, later on MOS Finance, of the revolutionary of the Jugantar group. They asked the question, he asked, how would Pakistan react? Then you speak about Surendra Mohanty, Ganatantra Parishad. Ganatantra Parishad was a party which formed the first coalition, so to say, loose coalition under Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, with the Janasangh cobbled up, and formed part of the first opposition in the first Lok Sabha. And then you reminded us of N.G. Gore also. Such fascinating characters, fascinating leaders who were so serious in their interventions, marshalling facts. I mean, I remember in 1960, even, you see, at that point of time, even the Congress members could make points, could raise points. Ram Subhag Singh, who was later on MOS, railways, telecommunication, etc. Ram Subhag Singh in 1960 debate in Lok Sabha raised this issue of industrialization on a very rapid basis, industrialization of India's borders. And he said why it was required. Because Nehru's policy was to leave the borders undeveloped. That itself was a security against incursion. Ram Subhag Singh raises the issue. And as you pointed here also out, Nehru always, very interesting, if you look at the pattern, he started off in your debate so lightly and casually and in such a narrow-minded spirit. He started off addressing the members like this, that he was disappointed over the members' view on the issue, saying so lightly, casually, and in such a narrow-minded spirit. Same, he was devastating with Ram Subhag Singh for having asked for the industrialization of border area, saying, let us industrialize the rest of India, then we'll think about the borders. So, I think why I'm making this point is because I find this very interesting. This has added on to the book, because often we forget this bit, the repartees, the discussions, the reposts that would take place in Lok Sabha, and with full facts and figures. And it was often, Kriplani, you mentioned Kriplani and that entire socialist group, they were devastating in their approach, like the Swatantra group also. And of course, the Janasangh was there. So the socialists, Swatantra, and the Janasangh, these three groups formed the opposition, and they saw through all this entire period. So, I just took some more time than perhaps others should have spoken, but I was a little carried away by your approach. So thank you very much for this very interesting, enlightening discussion, and Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee's intervention also, and Professor Vivek Debroy's opening remarks, full of very thought-provoking. And I really like to thank Dr. Sinha, and we look forward to his next book. And we look forward to discussing this. And I hope that you continue writing and that you find time to come out with such seminal work. I wish Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee also would write much more than he does at this point of time, because he has a lot to give and share, especially his constant connect with India and the United Nations history. That is something which is very important, and especially for the contemporary narrative of India's civilizational diplomacy and India's outreach, the way it has happened in the last 7 years, especially starting from 2015 when Ambassador Mukherjee was in the United Nations and the International Yoga Day was announced. So thank you everyone who has joined us here today. We'll keep, I look forward to keep meeting all of you, everyone here, with many more new ideas, new thoughts, and new programs in the coming days and weeks. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Thank you, Ashok. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you.